Hei. Velkommen hit. Tusen takk for at jeg får være her. Jeg heter Nils August Andresen, jeg er redaktør i avisen Minerva. Jeg er ikke noen Midtøsten-ekspert. Altså, alle i Norge er Midtøsten-ekspert. Jeg er ikke noe mindre enn andre. Men jeg skal bare lede samtalen. Forhåpentligvis skal dere ikke høre alt for mye av meg, men kanskje litt. Vi har prøvd å lære deg norsk. Det er bare å lese det akkurat som det står, og vi tror det skal gå bra. Ja. Vi hadde en god øvelse foran, og det gikk kjempefint. Vi er her for å snakke om noen av de ofte omstridte, vanskelig, upresise begrepene som brukes i denne konflikten. Folkemord, retten til selvforsvar, Israel som kolonimakt, from the river to the sea, sionisme, skal vi kanskje innom. Og med oss til det så har vi et flott, ikke da panel, men en flott rundebord, et potetgullbord. Og vi begynner med Hilde, som forteller litt om noen av disse begrepene fra sitt perspektiv, og så kommer det mange andre perspektiver etter hvert. Vær så god.
Har noen på? Nei. Jo. Alle hører meg. For de som da ikke vet hvem jeg er, så kan jeg jo kanskje introdusere meg selv litt bedre. Hilde H Waage, professor i historie ved Universitetet i Oslo, seniorforsker på Oslo. Og jeg har jobbet med konflikten mellom Israel og palestinerne og de omliggende arabiske landene i snart 20-30 år. Fra jeg i 1987 skrev og ga ut boka da staten Israel ble til, et stridsspørsmål i norsk politikk. Og den ble hemmeligstemplet i nesten 20 år. Det er ingen som har opplevd det, bare jeg. Så det er sånn det går. Utenriksdepartementet likte ikke det jeg skrev om Norge. Kanskje 15 år, men den ble da det ble veldig mye bra. Men jeg er veldig opptatt av at min jobb, ikke hvordan folk utlegger min jobb eller misbruker meg på den ene eller den andre måten. Min jobb er på en måte å være historiker, og det er jeg veldig opptatt av. Og jeg mener at hvis vi er på lag med felten, så er det noen sånne kjernespørsmål som vi må forholde oss til å løse. Og de kjernespørsmålene som ikke går vekk, og som vi liksom må løse, og som da Israel og Palestina og de omliggende arabiske statene ikke har løst, det mener jeg er følgende. Det er et Israel, en sterk israelsk stat, en jødisk stat som har kommet for å bli. Verdens kanskje 5. sterkeste militærmakt, alliert med USA, som har livets rett og skal bo og være i Midtøsten. Det må vi forholde oss til, ikke noe å diskutere. Og så må vi egentlig også forholde oss til, for det er også helt uløst, en palestinsk stat som døde i fødselen, og som ennå ikke har sett dagens lys. Og det tenker jeg på, det jeg tenker på da er jo da dette britiske mandatet Palestina, som mange heller ikke har litt klart for seg hva er, et britisk mandatområde, opprettet i 1920, hvis vi ønsker, det vedtok FN å dele i 2 stater. Resolusjon 181, 29. november 1987. Så forholde oss til det som vi kaller de okkuperte områdene. Og hva er de okkuperte områdene? Jo, det er i hvert fall det vi historikere mener er de områdene som Israel okkuperte etter krigen, eller under krigen i 1967. Det er Gazastripen, det er Vestbredden og Øst-Jerusalem og Golanhøydene. Dette er helt uløste spørsmål som vi også må forholde oss til. Og disse områdene i 1967 ble da okkupert fra henholdsvis Gazastripen fra Egypt, Vestbredden fra Jordan, også Øst-Jerusalem, og Golanhøydene fra Syria. Det må vi løse. Og så er det, for jeg synes ikke jeg tror det, 2 begreper igjen. De palestinske flyktningene rett til å vende tilbake til sine hjem som nå er i Israel, eller få kompensasjon for tap av sine hjem, som FN også vedtar hvert eneste år. FN-resolusjon 194, noe sånt, fra 1948. Hva skal vi gjøre med de palestinske flyktningene, og hvor skal vi gjøre av dem? Og det veldig viktig for meg å si at 4 uker etter at staten Israel ble opprettet i 1948, vedtok den israelske regjering kanskje et av de viktigste vedtakene den fattet, å stenge alle grensene for de palestinske flyktningene. Dernest så vedtok de andre arabiske landene etter hvert også å stenge sine grenser for de palestinske flyktningene, og da du det som på godt norsk kaller stuck på Gazastripen, og du stuck på Vestbredden, eller i de flyktningleirene du måtte være. Og det overhodet ikke noe hjertelig forhold mellom palestinerne og de arabiske landene. Jeg pleier å si det som Sammen til Øystein Sunde. Kjekt å ha, kanskje ikke få bruk for dem en vakker dag. De brukes i alle mulige forhandlinger. Så ingen av de arabiske landene vil ha palestinerne. Israel vil ikke ha dem. Vi i Europa vil i hvert fall ikke ha dem. Så det må vi også løse. Siste begrep, de jødiske bosetterne, som nå bor spredt utover Vestbredden og i Øst-Jerusalem, som nå rundt 700 000. Hva skal vi gjøre med de jødiske bosetterne? Det det som noen i fremtiden eller vi her kan diskutere og forholde oss til, men det kan vi i hvert fall ikke få på.
Takk. Du snakker om mange aspekter ved konflikten. Jeg lurer på om jeg kunne utfordre deg, Cecilie, til å knytte litt tettere på de begrepene som vi har blitt utfordret litt på. Altså, vi snakker om de okkuperte områdene, men da snakker vi også om begrepet okkupasjon. Det et av de ordene som de fleste antagelig er en måte de bruker, men som av og til forstås litt ulikt. Ikke minst når det kommer til Gaza, som det har vært omstridt, ikke sant, om det. Hva Gaza? Hva situasjonen på Gaza? Si litt om det begrepet. Litt om begrepet som du ikke var inne på. Det jo helt greit. Det ikke sikkert vi skal så mye om det, men dette begrepet kolonimakt som brukes en del i den norske debatten og i forbindelse med Israels opprettelse. Kan du si litt om disse ordene? Ja.
Veldig tett på mikrofonen.
Jeg skal lene meg frem her. Ja, ok. Hører dere meg nå? Ja. Jeg kan snakke opp, jeg har 3 sønner hjemme, så jeg snakker vanligvis ganske høyt til vanlig. Ok. Det mange begreper. Og nå mer begreper enn det vi vant med til vanlig, vil jeg si. Og de brukes også gitt det brutale angrepet på Israel 7. oktober, som har, sånn som jeg leser det, rokket ved den sosiale kontrakten til Israel. Det har rokket ved hele Israels eksistensberettigelse på en måte som jeg tror veldig få egentlig i Norge forstår. Hvordan dette angrepet veldig forskjellig fra andre angrep som Israel har vært utsatt for før, og hva det gjør med den israelske syken i Midtøsten. Ja, og det forplanter seg selvfølgelig også til Europa på mange måter. Og det det ene. Og det andre den krigen som Israel har svart med på Gaza, fordi Gaza skal erobres, ikke sant? Styresmaktene på Gaza skal bort, og det skal skje først og fremst gjennom bruk av militærmakt. Og det jo på den ene siden for å få kontroll over Gaza, fordi det for farlig for Israel å ha Gaza slik Israel har vært de siste 17 år, etter at Hamas tok over. Men det også snakk om dersom Hamas skulle kapitulere i morgen og si nå trekker vi oss, og vi på en måte fritt leide ut av Gaza i bytte mot å gi de resterende israelske gislene over, så ikke det sikkert at det løser problemet for Israel, fordi her det en kjerne av mennesker som utgjør en sikkerhetstrussel, uansett om de på Gaza eller andre steder. Altså, vi har en væpnet konflikt som nå i ferd med å nå et slags høydepunkt etter å ha blitt tilspisset seg over veldig, veldig lang tid. Og da får vi en bruk av begreper som ser annerledes ut enn det vi har til vanlig. Jeg vil bare starte med å si det, at begrepsbruken, sånn som den foregår, for eksempel i den norske debatten nå, den akkurat som om den har løftet seg fra bakken, sant? Og den svever litt. Jeg i mitt virke som folkerettsjurist forholder meg til okkupasjon som en veldig sånn klar definert størrelse. Og der det to forskjellige måter å definere okkupasjon på i folkeretten. Og den ene hva slags status et område har. Det et område okkupert? Øst-ukrainske provinser og Krim okkupert i folkeretten nå. Det en status disse områdene har. Og så spørsmålet, hva med de palestinske okkuperte områdene? Det status, eller det en følge av at israelske styrker har kontroll over et område? Fordi det en annen definisjon i folkeretten. Den mer funksjonell i forhold til hvilke regler gjelder. Så spørsmålet ikke bare slik at her kan Hellestveit sitte og si det okkupert eller ikke. Det kommer an på hva slags okkupasjon du snakker om. Sant? Og den ene okkupasjonen handler om hvilke rettigheter og plikter israelerne og palestinerne har i det møtet. Og her i Norge så snakker vi ofte på en måte som skulle tilsi at det bare israelerne som har plikter. Det ikke riktig. Det også plikter på palestinerne som speiler de. Ja. Så det det ene. Men jeg tenker nok at når vi snakker om okkuperte områder, så snakker vi om statusen folkerettslig. Og der det slik at Gaza hører sammen med de andre palestinske områdene, altså Vestbredden og Jerusalem, egentlig Øst-Jerusalem, sånn folkerettslig. De aller fleste statene i verden anser at dette har en status som okkupert område. Det inkluderer, ganske viktig, de 5 faste vetomaktene i FNs sikkerhetsråd, inkludert amerikanerne. Senest gjentok amerikanerne dette i 2021. Og de har gjentatt, de har vært med på resolusjoner de siste 2 årene som også gjentar det. Så det egentlig liksom 2 forskjellige ting. Dette har jo kommet opp nå fordi det en sak foran den internasjonale domstolen i Haag, en advisory opinion som det heter, som ikke en rettslig bindende beslutning, men som en advisory opinion, en rådgivende uttalelse. Og når disse 15 dommerne som valgt ut av de store rettstradisjonene i verden, og som har stormakten i ryggen til Israel, når de 15 dommerne enige på enkelte punkter, selv om det strengt tatt en advisory opinion, da har det veldig sterk folkerettslig kraft. Så det betyr at den saken som foregår i Haag nå, som aller viktigst, ikke folkemordsprosessen, men det denne andre prosessen, som hvor høringene nettopp ble avsluttet. Det var de lengste høringene noensinne siden 1945 foran domstolen. Og de handler nettopp om effekten av Israels politikk og praksis på de palestinske okkuperte områdene. Da denne saken ble overført av FNs generalforsamling i 2022, så var det mange som lurte på om Gaza var med. Jeg tilhørte de som lurte på om egentlig Gaza var med, for Gaza was nowhere to be found in the papers. Og det var ingen som lurte på det i februar da disse høringene startet. Så det gjør at nå på en måte Gaza plassert inn under israelsk okkupasjon i begge betydninger av ordet egentlig. Og det betyr at da får du en samlet behandling foran domstolen i Haag, i det som trolig kommer til sommeren. Så det på en måte dette med okkupasjon. Det litt sånn, det et begrep som har vært ganske sånn diskutert, og det diskutert andre steder enn også når det gjelder Israel-Palestina-konflikten. På samme måte, egentlig.
Det som et spørsmål i hvordan vi forstår. Bare et oppfølgingsspørsmål, Cecilie. Altså når vi bruker ordet okkupert, de fleste som bruker, altså noen ganger så bruker som sier om det en status, og vi bruker det sånn, vi sier ofte de okkuperte områdene som et synonym til Vestbredden og Gaza. Men ofte brukes det også en moralsk betydning. Man sier at disse områdene okkupert, og implikasjonen på en måte at dette ulovlig å opphøre. Men det jo en forenkling. En okkupasjon må ikke være ulovlig. Og et spørsmål altså dersom det ikke mulig å få en avtale med landpartene, hvordan skal man da behandle en okkupasjon? Jeg sier ikke at det ikke det, men la oss det som et premiss. som varer over så lang tid. Så hvor lenge kan en okkupasjon vare under det navnet?
Det jo en av de temaene man ber domstolen i Haag om å ta stilling til. Og det som har vært Israels tilnærming her, vi har jo et okkupasjonsregelverk som laget for å beskytte to ting. Beskytte interessene til de to statene og deres militære interesser på den siden, og beskytte sivilbefolkningen på begge sider. Sivilbefolkningen til okkupasjonsmakten, og sivilbefolkningen til den okkuperte. Men det et regelverk som laget ut fra en forutsetning om at okkupasjonen varer fra 3 måneder til 5 år maksimum. 10 år, hvis du legger ondviljen til. Men dette en okkupasjonssituasjon som etter Israels egne juridiske instanser, domstoler, har vart nå i over 50 år. 60. Altså Israels egen definisjon av dette, juridisk, som okkupasjon. Da spørsmålet, kan du da forholde deg til de samme reglene? Og det Israels høyesterett har gjort, altså Israels høyesterett som sitter som High Court of Justice, som har tiltatt seg retten til å sitte over det israelske militæret som okkupasjonsmakt, det å si at nei, men over tid så må vi lirke det litt til, for ellers så blir det ikke rettferdig, det blir på en måte brudd med det som forutsetningene. Det gjør at den israelske okkupasjonsretten og praksisen rundt det har tatt inn over seg at du kan ikke ha okkupasjonen som om den skulle bare være sånn evig. Og det har jo gjort at den israelske staten har en praksis overfor de okkuperte områdene som har en sånn tosidighet ved seg. På den ene siden så gir det en mindre brutal okkupasjon. Ikke sant? Fordi rettsvesenet passer på. Media i Israel passer på, sivilsamfunnet passer på, de palestinske sivilsamfunnsorganisasjonene har fått virke på en måte som har gjort den okkupasjonen til mindre brutal. Jeg jobber nå med okkupasjonen til Russland i Ukraina. Mindre brutal. Men samtidig så fungerer det som en rettferdiggjørelse som gjør at israelere flest kan si vi får ikke løst denne konflikten, og enn så lenge så har vi den mest humane okkupasjonen i verdenshistorien. Hvem kan love noe? Hvem kan forvente noe mer? Så den måten å sette dette her opp på har vært en viktig medvirkende faktor til at israelere som gode demokrater kan si vi lever i en rettsstat som har den beste okkupasjonen som penger kan levere. Og det også et problem, fordi når du lever på den andre siden og ikke okkupert, så lever du ikke i de daglige effektene av den okkupasjonen. Så det en sånn tosidighet her, tenker jeg nok innebygget i det systemet.
Det som deres variant av verdens grønneste olje, det der. Jeg får olje, altså. Det et helt kort spørsmål fra publikum. Nå må jeg litt kort, for vi skal gå videre. Det nettopp om Gaza. Altså, for den juridiske definisjonen veldig tydelig av det. Nå selvfølgelig ganske men hvis vi tar disse årene mellom 2007 og 2023, når israelske myndigheter ikke utøver kontroll på selve Gaza-stripen. Hvorfor det at den definisjonen okkupert, og hva det israelske synet der? Hva kan du si om den?
Altså, i 2005 så trakk israelerne seg tilbake fra Gaza. Det var en unilateral tilbaketrekning som Ariel Sharon sto for. Det var 5 år etter at den israelske hæren trukket seg tilbake en unilateralt fra Libanon. Fra libanesisk side, som var også en okkupasjon. Og det som skjedde i år 2000 da Israel trakk seg tilbake fra Libanon, det var at FNs sikkerhetsråd sa yes, strålende Israel, dette aksepterer vi, nå anser vi den grensen mellom Israel og Libanon for å være en internasjonalt anerkjent grense. En grønn linje. FN-pakten beskytter Israel mot Libanon. Så derfor når Hizbollah angrep Israel i 2006, så kunne Israel svare på det og gå inn i Israel med FN-pakten i hånd. Da har du selvforsvarsrett etter FN-pakten, for det en internasjonalt anerkjent grense. Og så var det som Ariel Sharon ga uttrykk for når han trakk seg tilbake fra Gaza i 2005, trakk tilbake settlementene, og dermed også de israelske styrkene som sto der, til det for å passe på disse settlementene, så ønsket Israel at denne grensen rundt Gaza også skulle anerkjennes som en internasjonal grense. Ariel Sharon dro til Hvite hus og fikk nei fra George Bush junior, i hans, det var i 2005. Og det amerikanerne sa da var at hvis vi lar dere få aksept for det, så kommer israelerne til å si neste gang de setter seg til forhandlingsbord med palestinerne, men palestinske staten, men den finnes allerede, den er en kvasistat, den heter Gaza, og hovedstaden heter Gaza City, og der starter forhandlingene. Så det både amerikanerne og alle andre land tenkte da, var at vi kan ikke gi det til Israel, selv om dette her var etter den andre intifadaen, og på en måte palestinerne lå nede med brukken rygg, og de fleste stater holdt ganske med Israel på dette tidspunktet, så sa man det kan vi ikke gjøre, fordi da trekker vi teppet under bena på den palestinske forhandlingsposisjonen. Det kan vi ikke gjøre. Og det gjør at den grensen, og det er viktig i forhold til det som skjer i dag, den grensen mellom Israel og Gaza, det er ikke en internasjonalt anerkjent grense. Da kan du ikke påberope deg selvforsvar. Sånn som du kan under FN-pakten, hvis russerne angriper Finnmarken vår, FN-pakten og NATO-pakten og litt sånn. Men når det ikke er en internasjonal grense, så er det andre typer selvforsvar som gjelder. Det er fortsatt selvforsvar, men det er ikke den samme typen.
Men da er det mer, som du beskriver det nå, det er en politisk prosess enn en egentlig juridisk prosess som avgjør den statusen. Så vi hører med deg om det samme. Altså, hvordan kan du tenke om Gaza før denne konflikten? Altså, hvordan skal vi forstå det israelske selvforsvaret i denne situasjonen? Hvis det ikke engang er selvforsvaret etter FN-pakten.
Du starter med et meget svært spørgsmål. Forstår I dansk?
Ja.
Er der nogen, der ikke forstår det?
Ja.
Is it better with English?
Kom lige nu.
No, it's very sad.
Nej, du må godt tale
It's
dansk.
sad as well, but I think it's better with English because then at least I think you'll get most of it. Okay. Well, I'm a lawyer as well. And I work at a Danish paper, but I've got a long history in sordid long history in politics, and I've covered for different media foreign affairs, and been also working abroad in Africa and Asia, and been following politics for many years. I was in Gaza this summer. And in Gaza City, on top of one of the West Bank, and I was in East Jerusalem. It was very interesting. I've been to the area many times, and since I've got this long history in politics, and I write about politics and foreign affairs mainly. I would say, I know that there are people who say an attack like the one that happened on the 7th of October needs to be addressed in a criminal court in Israel. And I think what we are dealing with is it is an insurgency from Hamas, and it's an insurgency that is going really well. I wrote a column recently where I said it is going splendidly for Hamas. The reason I said that, I think that in itself, of course, that's controversial because people will say, you know, clearly things are not all good in Gaza. But the reason it's going splendidly is that if you praise the Hamas as an insurgent army in an asymmetrical conflict with a military strategy that is prepared to sacrifice your own civilians with view to a greater aim, it is a spectacular success. And the minute this attack happened, I wrote a piece that said Hamas had 10 reasons to commit this crime, but will be remembered as the Palestinians disaster or misfortune and shame. The 10 reasons are that it was an effort to disrupt the Israeli Arab Spring or the Abraham Accords, that process. It was an effort to put yourself in history on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. It was something that could humiliate the IDF, the strongest military in the region. It was an effort that could sink Israeli politics, which it has done. It could possibly sink Netanyahu as a factor in Israeli politics, which looks very likely. It would revigorate the Palestinian cause in international discourse, which it has done. It has put Hamas out of isolation, which it has been for a decade and a half. The tremendous success was seen in Moscow these days, where the different Palestinian factions are looking to unite. So, if you deem this as a military strategy, where the loss of civilian lives does not matter, because these are all, and I'm quoting the Hamas, happy martyrs for the cause. It is a spectacular success. And I think that we have to, and I've said that, we have to not exclude that we are part of this military strategy in the West. Whenever we have big demonstrations, what is happening on social media is part of this military success. Yeah.
I want to relate that to the concept of genocide, which is one of the concepts that you hear a lot in the Western discourse and in the demonstrations. And you talked about how this is part of a strategy that sees this not necessarily as an aim in itself, but at least as a more than acceptable collateral cost. What is the meaning of, how should we talk about this word that has been used?
And you can speak Norwegian, it's fine. Fortunately, I understand Norwegian. But no, I think these words are so extreme. We see it in the conflict in Russia and Ukraine as well. The words that are being thrown around are so extreme. I agree that Israel is bearing, could be, going through this response in a much more clever and lenient and sensitive way. I think, in fact, that maybe the biggest error that Israel has committed is to do exactly what the Hamas wanted, namely dragging the IDF into Gaza. That is a military strategic possible error. They didn't have a lot of options, I guess. And I think the court must decide if this is a genocide or not. But I'm part of my country went to war in Iraq. As we didn't care how many people died, but we know it's like 6 figures at least. Nobody charges us with genocide, even though it brought disaster to the region for a decade and a half, and it has put Iran in a position of strength that we did not foresee, because we are clearly not very intelligent. But we have a war in the Congo, 6 million people so far. We have Yemen, also 6 figures at least. We have Syria, maybe 500,000 people. These words are extreme, and I think what we see is many different factors working together to propel emotion. We have aid organizations, political actors, we have civilian organizations, we have the internet, and we have, I think, very clearly identifiable antagonistic intelligence services also propelling social media to elevate emotion. And I think it's time for kind of just reason and leaving the emotion maybe for later.
Det høres klokt ut. Det høres også ut som det ikke kommer til å skje umiddelbart. Men Torkel, utfordrer deg også på nettopp dette med altså denne retorikken, og si litt om hvorfor den blir så ekstrem. Du hører folkemord og kolonistat brukes en del.
Ja, veldig spennende å høre på de andre tre her. Det mulig å høre meg nå?
Tett på mikrofon.
Hva?
Tett på mikrofon.
Nils August, kan jeg begynne bare med en kort kommentar til vår danske gjest om dette poenget med at Hamas har suksess, for det synes jeg var veldig interessant det du sa. For Sinwar sa jo det samme for noen dager siden, han sa at dette gikk etter boken. Men jeg ikke sikker på det, og det 4 grunner til at jeg ikke så sikker på det. Det første jo at jeg tror Abraham-avtalen kommer til å fortsette når dette over. Jeg tror Saudi-Arabia 100% innstilt på å fortsette samarbeidet med Israel. Så jeg tror Israel kommer til å ha et utmerket forhold med de viktige araberstatene hvis vi ser litt fram i tid. Så den planen om å på en måte deraile det samarbeidet, den tror jeg ikke kommer til å fungere. Det andre jo at målet var jo å få til et opprør inne i Israel. For palestinerne, ikke sant, når de startet angrepet, så sa de Hamas at nå må palestinere i Israel reise seg mot Israel. Det skjedde ikke. Det tredje var at Hezbollah skulle være med i angrepet. Det skjedde ikke. Hezbollah tør ikke. Og Hezbollah blir jo bombet hver eneste dag. Og Hezbollah redde for å engasjere seg. Jeg tror vi får en krig mot Hezbollah i løpet av året, da. Men ikke på Hezbollahs premisser. Det fjerde grunnen til at jeg tror dette var en dårlig idé, at og det jo ikke et tap for Hamas, men jeg tror vi får en massiv høyrebølge i Vesten mot Palestina-aktivismen som vi har sett i Europa nå. Og jeg tror vi kommer til å få ytre høyrepartier som vinner valg etter valg i Vesten, som delvis, ikke bare, men delvis som en følge av dette. Så jeg tror det mange ting, og selvfølgelig så kan det jo være at vi klarer å nå Hamas sitt lederskap, da. Så jeg synes det var interessant det du sa, og det kan være du har rett, men det kan være... Ja.
Du har også rett.
Jeg bare avbryter spørsmålet, det litt bare for å blande meg inn i denne diskusjonen. Det kan dere andre kommentere til senere, men en ting man ser noen tendenser til, kanskje farlig å kalle det mer enn det, men noen tendenser til det israelske samfunnet at denne krigen litt med på å gjøre israelske arabere til israelere. Og det en sånn interessant prosess som i en viss forstand måtte skje en eller annen gang. Og det kriger som pleier å gjøre det. Det kriger som skaper nasjonen. Hvis at Cecilie vil svare kort, da, så kommer jeg tilbake til spørsmålet.
Ja, fordi dette med om Hamas lykkes, jeg enig med vår danske gjest, men begrunnelsen for hvorfor annerledes, og det jo litt interessant. Jeg vil også si i forlengelsen av det du sier, Nils August, at denne type kriger, som åpenbart var en del av planen skulle komme, den gjør noe dramatisk med befolkningene som involvert i det. Dette her noe helt annet enn det Israel-Palestina har vært involvert i før, og det gjør noe med utsynet i det israelske samfunnet og utsynet i det palestinske samfunnet for hva som mulig. En enstatsløsning med liksom integrerte statsborgere etter dette her, det ikke mulig. Her må det en tostatsløsning til. Det det som ligger i karakteren av de voldshandlingene som nå utføres. Og jeg tror også det Hamas har klart å gjøre, jeg vet ikke om det var sabotasje som var hensikten. Jeg tror det Hamas har klart å gjøre å melde seg på de forhandlingene mellom Saudi-Arabia og Israel og USA med et brak. Ikke sant? Nå starter forhandlingene på Gaza, faktisk. Og det en ganske stor endring i forhold til det som har vært rammene for denne konflikten i 3 år. Når du ser på hva slags motstand Israel møter i forskjellige fora, hva slags medvind palestinerne har, selv om de faktisk ikke klarer å samle seg sånn som de egentlig burde, så det klart, dette angrepet, med det og med svaret, har Hamas klart å gjøre dramatiske ting med rammene for forhandlingene mellom Israel og Palestina.
Men dere, nå har vi begynt å diskutere substansen i konflikten. Det samlet her en begrepsdebatt. Du skal få slippe til, men først må vi ta spørsmål til Torkel. Hvorfor blir det så opprettet? Hvordan tenker du om disse ordene?
Jo, nettopp. Så alt vi har sagt nå, det var jo en slags digresjon. Det helt riktig. Så yes, nei, men jeg tror det blitt sagt veldig mye smart her, og alle ved bordet kan mange ting som jeg ikke kan, men jeg veldig opptatt av begrepshistorie, da. Og jeg tenker litt på det sånn at når vi snakker om dette, så det mange presise, gode begreper fra folkeretten, historiefaget, whatever. Men så det også en svær sekk med begreper som oppstod utviklet seg egentlig under den kalde krigen fra 60-tallet, spesielt på 70-tallet. Og disse begrepene utviklet seg i, hva kan vi si, en slags retorisk konflikt mellom på den ene siden kommunistblokken og mange araberstater og en del andre stater utenfor Vesten, da, for å si det sånn. Og på den andre siden Vesten, USA med USA, selvfølgelig i spissen, hvor Israel ble et sårt punkt som liksom resten av verden brukte for å, hva skal vi si, for å erte, eller for å liksom ødelegge for Vesten, da. Og poenget at det utviklet seg et helt sett med begreper. Og mest kjent selvfølgelig da FNs generalforsamling vedtok resolusjon 3379 i 1975, hvor man sa at sionisme rasisme. Men det var egentlig bare kulminasjonen av egentlig et helt 10 år med utvikling av begreper rundt Israel, rundt sionisme. Så hvis man ser både i FN-systemet og utenfor, så ser man at disse begrepene oppstår, og de utvikler seg. Så jeg opptatt av at det en sånn sekk med veldig følelsesladede begreper, da, som vi har med oss fra den tiden. Og jeg tror noe av problemet at når Cecilie snakker om okkupasjon, så det ingen som blir sinte. Men når vi trekker opp disse begrepene, for eksempel apartheid-begrepet, rasismebegrepet eller settlerkolonialismebegrepet, så trekker vi opp disse begrepene fra den sekken med det vi egentlig kan kalle antisionistiske begreper. Når vi trekker opp de begrepene, så merker veldig mange at vi har noen doble agendaer med en gang. Og da reagerer folk veldig umiddelbart. Og det blir kanskje redde for hva som kommer. De blir veldig følsomme på argumentasjonen, da. Så jeg tror det noe av problemet, at den sekken med begreper, den har vi med, og begreper veldig knyttet til følelser, spesielt disse da.
Da skal vi til deg, Hilde. Jeg så du hadde hånden oppe, så du skal få lov å si det hva enn du vil kommentere på, men så et spørsmål når du ferdig med det, og det går litt til det du begynte med innledningsvis, og litt i forlengelsen av begrepene som Torkel trekker opp. Og det right to return. Hele den sekken der, 5 millioner eller 6 millioner, hvor mange du vil, 7 millioner flyktninger som kommer tilbake, eller noe annet. Men om det det de skal, så finnes det ikke lenger noen jødisk majoritetsstat i området. Og den diskusjonen nå, den jo aktualisert litt grann av dette slagordet «From the river to the sea», eller det som var en kronikk i norske aviser nå helgen om hvor Megdev hadde laget dette skillet, jøde, israeler, sionist. Og det riktig frem at det var mulig sikkert å være en god jøde, men det hørtes ut som det var mulig å være en god sionist. Så hva tenker du om dette from the river to the sea, og setter litt i sammenheng med det du sa om right to return og flyktningsspørsmålet? Og så eventuelt hva annet du vil si først da.
Ja, nei, altså jeg prøver...
Mikrofon!
Jeg prøver jo iherdig å holde fast ved det som på en måte min jobb og min rolle, og det egentlig da å være en historiker. Sånn at når da Torkel snakker om alle disse ladede begrepene, så jo det historiske begreper som, i hvert fall jeg mener, brukes politisk. Sant?
Selvfølgelig.
Helt selvfølgelig. Men det betyr jo ikke at vi ikke må og skal bruke noen av dem. Så jeg personlig, som historiker, jeg bruker aldri begrepet apartheid, fordi at det plutselig så ødelegger det jo med en gang hele debatten. Da er vi jo liksom rett i skyttergravene fullstendig. Men jeg er også i Sør-Afrika. Og historikere liker jo ikke sånne historiske paralleller heller. Men jeg bruker jo helt klart og tydelig de okkuperte områdene. Men jeg bruker aldri begrepet Israel som kolonimakt. For at det sier jo noe om intensjon og andre ting. Så at vi må liksom rydde litt grann opp i det. Og for meg er jo, og jeg er i hvert fall ikke jurist, men for meg er jo folkerett på en måte ganske enkelt. Og det er følgende veldig enkle versjon av folkerett. Juristene kommer nå til å daue, men det får de bare gjøre. Altså, det er ikke lov til å rappe land fra andre.
Det var mye av verdenshistorie som ikke med i dragsuget, tror jeg.
Nå snakker vi litt sånn for å klargjøre veldig til det jeg mener. Altså, Norge kan ikke i henhold til noen sånne spilleregler vi har i internasjonal politikk si til Sverige. En gang var Jämtland og Härjedalen og Bohuslän, det var virkelig norsk. Og vi vil ha det tilbake. Vi tar nå den norske her, og så marsjer vi inn i Sverige, og så tar vi de områdene, for de var egentlig våre. Og så tar vi svenskene, og så bosetter vi nordmenn. Altså, de fleste ville sagt at det ville ikke gått helt av, at det ikke gikk helt bra for nordmennene. Sånn at de okkuperte områdene. Men det jeg er veldig opptatt av, er at det er noen sånne kjernespørsmål som vi politisk må løse. Og det er hva skal vi gjøre med de okkuperte områdene? Og det er jo i hvert fall et problem for Israel også. Hva skal vi gjøre med, nå er jeg nesten på å svare på spørsmålet ditt, hva skal vi gjøre med palestinere og de palestinske flyktningene? Og det er ikke jeg som sier right to return, altså det er FN som vedtar dette hvert eneste år.
Det vet jeg, men det løser jo åpenbart ikke problemet, så nå spør jeg deg hvordan du kobler det til sånne ord som da from the river to the sea og...
Jeg kobler ikke det to the river to the sea, for hvis du da spør en historiker, som er vanlig her, hvem er det som bruker mest begrepet from the river to the sea? Da tenker jeg på noe helt annet, da tenker jeg på Ariel Sharon. Jordan is Palestine. Da er jeg plutselig i en helt annen, mer høyreorientert, ekstrem sionistisk ideologi. Hvis du spør meg om hva jeg tenker på da, så er det det jeg tenker på. Det var ikke sikkert det du trodde jeg kom til å svare. Men liksom, det er bare helt begrep er bare helt problematisk. Men for meg så er dette med right to return, det er koblet til løsningen av de palestinske flyktningene, og det er koblet til den evige lange diskusjonen om hvem skal bære ansvaret for at palestinerne slipper i første omgang. Det er sånn den koblingen da er.
Kan vi ta en liten runde akkurat på denne right to return? Vi kan koble det litt til dette begrepet from the river to the sea, og kanskje litt om sionisme når vi kommer til deg, Torkel. Altså hva... Ja, det er jo helt riktig, ikke sant? Det vet altså resolusjoner hele tiden, hva FN har sagt og så videre, selv om man kan diskutere flyktninger eller flyktningene og sånne språklige spørsmål, men hvor står dette spørsmålet nå, både i begrepsbruken nå i folkeretten og i politikken? Så politikken er jo dødt, men hvordan skal vi snakke om det?
Jeg kan fortelle hvordan I can explain how it's done in Denmark, which and I think actually one of the most interesting things is with this conflict is how much it became identity politics in our part of the world really fast. We have big crowds. Danes don't demonstrate normally. We might gather. The king is pronounced and we gather, but anything political we don't because it might rain. Football, so when 30,000 people stand in the streets and shout from the river to the sea, that's noted. And there have been many people and many demonstrations. And how I understand that slogan in the light of what has happened is the eradication of Israel, which is the aim of Hamas. The aim of Hamas is not, and it is clearly stated, not a two-state solution. And what I've seen in our country is a radicalization of the debate in the direction of the position of the most extreme Palestinian factions. I can explain this is an anecdote. A friend of mine who is, she's a judge, and in Denmark, she sent me a little pin for the jacket. It was a pin with an Israeli and a Palestinian flag. And, before the 7th of October, I would have thought that would be not controversial at all. Everyone wants a two-state solution. It might be that the powers within Israel and Palestine does not, but everyone else wants them to get along. So I put the little pin on Facebook. It got 1,000 comments and counting, and people were. The vile language, I'm not going to entertain you with the vile language, but it was very, very hectic, that Facebook discussion, which cemented to me that now we are beyond. We are where it is acceptable to say we want Israel to cease to exist. Israel is not, is to be likened with the most brutal regimes in the world, and any kind of support or acceptance of Israel is something that you can frown upon. And I also think that some of the concepts that has come up in this debate will hail from way before 1975 or those years. I think there are very, very clear anti-Semitic tropes to be found in this debate, be it the blood libel, be it the myth that the Jewish people are somehow more intelligent, and which is why they funded the Hamas, so that the Hamas could attack them, so that they could eradicate the Palestinians, etc. They're so transparent anti-Semitic tropes that, to me, it is flabbergasting that how it has been able to rise as like an old spectre.
Cecilie, nå så jeg på deg at du tar feil om målet til Hamas, men du får lov å si noe om det likevel.
Jeg trenger ikke å henge meg opp i det. Men jeg er veldig enig i det siste som vår danske venn sier. At det i det voldsomme raseriet som har bredt seg nå, så er det mange forskjellige bevegelser samtidig. Her er det ganske naive, velmenende, velintensjonerte mennesker som ikke ser helt hvilke krefter det er som leder de av gårde. Jeg tror dette er veldig, veldig farlig for våre samfunn, hvis vi snakker om situasjonen i europeiske land. Det er en ting. La oss holde oss til Midtøsten sånn i første omgang her.
Silje, jeg må avbryte et øyeblikk. Vi har fått beskjed fra høyere makter om at vi alle sammen skal snakke engelsk. So we all
need to speak
English. Okay. It's a message I got from the higher powers.
No, it's because there are few people who don't understand Norwegian.
It's fine. We're all the same for now. It's we show that we're an international. Do any language. German, any language.
Okay, no, so occupation and now there are some definitions here that are linked to not necessarily what is currently the situation on the ground, but linked to larger concepts. When you talk about occupation, occupied Palestine, you implicitly talk about a two-state solution, because you talk about a Palestinian state that is currently being occupied by an Israeli state. the Israeli state, and it is supposed to withdraw so that the Palestinian state can exist without occupation. Now, when you talk about apartheid, which is the other kind of definition that is being spurred also before the ICJ in The Hague, apartheid cannot coexist with occupation. They are, they are mutually exclusive because apartheid belongs to a one-state solution. And it's basically a question of the human rights position of one segment of the population based on ethnic or religious groupings. So basically, whether you talk about occupation or apartheid, in that language lies a preference. Now, a lot of people don't really understand this because they know this is very bad what I see. I will call it the worst thing I can get my hands on if it is genocide or occupation or apartheid, and I don't mind. But we should mind, because in the legal language, this is not a detail. So that is one thing. When it comes to the issue of colonialism, I'm not going to go back to your view of international law and the use of force. I will say this, though, that the prohibition to use military power to change borders was introduced in 1928. Why? Because the colonial powers had discovered the earth. They didn't want to change the borders by the use of military power anymore because it would cost them too much to guard the borders of their colonies. And then we've had a decolonization period, and we have now sovereign states. What is happening out in space? The great powers are questioning, is that a place where we can perhaps reinvent this idea that you can use military power to conquer new territory? Perhaps. So I wouldn't be too sure about that rule over the next couple of decades.
I still call them on the occupied territories.
Exactly. But when we talk about colonialism, we talk about history. Now, there are two states that were not really, it was not really brought to the end, and it was Western Sahara and Palestine. And a couple of others, but these are the ones that the Kurds, but you know what happened to them. So it's kind of an historical issue. It does not really have to do with current international law, and the arguments being brought before the ICJ now is precisely about the right to self-determination. And the right to self-determination, if you talk about that outside of colonial history, it's very dangerous. So it's not really something that we want to use. We want to talk about the historical colonies, and then of course Palestine comes up. Let me say one final thing about this issue from the river to the sea. I've been involved with the Arab world, with the Palestinians and with the Israelis for 3 decades. I speak many of the languages in the region, and in terms of definitions and slogans, for me, I have always seen from the river to the sea as something being used by 2 types of people: those who want a one-state solution for Palestinians only, and those who want a one-state solution for Israelis only. So it is basically, that is the very content of this slogan. Now, when I go and watch demonstrations in Oslo, I hear that slogan a lot. And people who I know, I ask them, why are you using this slogan? And they say, it doesn't mean what you think it means. And I think this is about the same thing as if I come down tomorrow with a swastika saying, I have now read in a book that this originally was an Indian signal, and it doesn't mean what you think it means. You cannot redefine the meaning of slogans in that way and believe that you can get away with it, because you feed into forces that you do not know how to control. So
I'll go to you, and I'll start from the slogan, from the river to the sea, and it's being used in the Norwegian context, and you have had a challenge, in a sense, to Norwegian foreign policy by groups that normally do not challenge Norwegian foreign policy, Muslim minority groups, mostly. We have this very famous now article by, again, Magde, saying that there's no more Norwegian we. And then the famous and usually very moderate physician, Wasim Zahid, also said, you know, the Norwegian we is being splintered on the Norwegian policy towards Israel and Gaza. And I wouldn't say as a consequence, but at least, you know, the Prime Minister answered him, and whether it's a consequence of this or not, probably not, but Norway has, and this is a question from one of our viewers, those here, or the billions of people who are watching online, who ask, why is Norwegian policy among the most critical in Europe? I mean, obviously a lot of countries have critical comments, but Norway, why is Norway, we're far from Israel, why is Norwegian policy more critical of Israel than a lot of comparable nations like Sweden, Finland, Denmark?
That's a great question, and I know Hilde can say a lot about that. But can I start by just saying a few words about the previous question, Nils August, concerning right to return and so on?
Okay.
Yeah. And then I'll get to your main question. I'll be quick. I mean, everybody, if you look at the origins of the Palestinian refugee problem, and and Hilde started by asking who's responsible for fixing it, right? And if you look at it historically, it started as a middle-sized refugee crisis, in the sense that if you look at refugee crises in the 20th century, it would not figure among the 20 biggest ones, right? There's 750,000 people being displaced. There were massacres, yes. Many people were forced to flee, etc. Terrible. And many people left of their own devices, etc. And I think this is important. And the reason why I want to bring this up is that we have had in this country a discussion recently about UNRWA. And UNRWA has been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. And these things go together because they're interesting.
A lot of groups and people have been nominated for that prize.
Yes, certainly, but this has caused some, Anyway, the point, what I think has lacked in the Norwegian debates about UNRWA is what we know historically about the insistence of Arab countries to keep the refugee problem alive as a weapon in the fight in the war against Israel. And that is, to my mind anyway, Hilde to fill me out, but I really think this is well documented, that many Arab states have wanted to keep the refugee problem alive as a weapon, and the world has solved a number of much larger refugee problems. So how to divide the responsibility at least has to start with history in that sense, I think. And also, this is of course connected to your question of the concept of colonialism as well, which I see not as an either-or question. I think it's a really interesting question. Of course, there is an element of colonialism in Jews going to Palestine and buying land, starting to cultivate land. Of course, there's an element of colonialism. The point is not either-or. The point is that the use of terms like settler colonialism is, as I started to say, there's this bag of concepts that are very touchy. Well, you can call them anti-Zionist concepts. And when that particular concept is used, it does two things. It has two functions. Firstly, it hides the fact that more than half the Jews of Israel are from Arab countries, right? So it makes it seem like, everybody came from Europe. They were white colonialists. So it's part of the global, the colonial sort of white supremacy language in a way. It can be, not always, but it can be. Also, it hides the fact that Jews have a very, very long presence in Palestine. You know, the cultural heritage and the actual present there is hidden by the use of this concept, and that's a problem. Now, to your question, Nils August, why is Norwegian discourse so negative to Israel? Well, I'm just finishing a book manuscript about that question, trying to go into what is peculiar about the Norwegian debates about the Middle East, and Hilde, of course, done the groundwork about Norwegian perceptions of Israel from 48 and onwards. But I think there's a lot more to say about what has happened since the turn of the millennium, because that hasn't really been explored, and I'm trying to do that. And I think my short answer is that I believe that the Norwegian radical left has been much more effective in mainstreaming their ideas about Israel and Palestine than they have been, for instance, in Denmark or in Finland. And I've interviewed, a lot of politicians, labor people in all these countries to try to document that. So that's part of my answer to that.
Yes. I think that, Torkel, you are mixing many things together. And just to make very clear, the term right to return has nothing to do with UNRWA. You should separate these two things historically, because the right to return that is the UN resolution that is adopted every year, almost, and that has to do with what are the UN or the international community going to do with the Palestinians who partly left voluntarily and partly were driven out by Israel. What are we going to do in order to solve this problem?
Yeah.
So that is very clear. And it's also very clear in, at least seen from a diplomatic historian, is that we do agree, at least most historians and politicians, that the term right to return these days, for the last 20, 30 decades, means that this applies for Palestinians to return to the future Palestinian state.
Sure.
Not to Israel.
That is not universally agreed, though. But this is not, then it's not a question even for Israel at all. But let me challenge you on that just for a second, because when you talk about the right to return, it's being used. I mean, this was a question in the Taliban negotiations in 2001, and then we did not only talk about the Palestinian areas, obviously. So the question is, when you say, what can the international community do to solve the refugee crisis? Wouldn't the simplest thing be to say, to be unequivocal, that these people will not return to Israel, so the Arab states can no longer use them for that purpose, and we'll have to find a different solution? Wouldn't that be the most efficient way of spurring some sort of solution?
The point is that during the Oslo negotiations and all the negotiations that followed, I've written several books and articles, the Palestinian refugee problem was out. It was not a part of the discussion. It has not been properly discussed at all, because Israelis and the PLO, representing Palestinians living in the occupied territories, they agreed that they would not even discuss what to do with the Palestinian refugees. So it is far too easy to say that they are only used by the Arab states. They are just as much used by Israel. And here, neither the Arab states nor the Israelis want anything to do with the Palestinian refugees. So the problem is, what are we going to do with them?
No, I agree it's a problem. I agree it's a problem.
That's a political problem. But you cannot just say that the Arab states are the only one here using the Palestinian refugees.
I think my question is more that if you would say that, okay, these people can return to Israel, then there would no longer be a Jewish state in Palestine. So, or in that region. So that is not going to happen. And shouldn't the world be very, very clear about that? So there are no misconceptions on that front.
But during the talks, and this, the Palestinian refugee problem was not high on that agenda at all, but it was very clear to the Americans and the Norwegians and everyone who participated that they could, of course, not return to Israel. So I think that in political terms, this is very clear.
Exactly.
But the problem then is that the Arab states also say that we will have nothing to do with them. It's not our responsibility. And of course the Europeans will not have any Palestinians into Europe.
Cecilie, you've been very patient. Thank you.
I just want to say this. The Palestinian refugee problem is the reason why most of the Arab states have never ratified the Refugee Convention, because that would oblige them to naturalize Palestinians over time. The problem now is, of course, it is not only the Palestinian refugee problem that they are suffering with in the Middle East. They have millions of refugees from Syria, and some of them are not being welcomed back. So, I mean, the Palestinians are currently constituting only one of many refugee groups. So, but I'm not going to talk about that anything more except for saying this. I believe that the character of this current war is so it's really having a big effect in the Middle East. And the question, of course, is what will happen afterwards? Will the other countries pick up the stick and say we will naturalize the Palestinian refugees that we have in our country? It depends on what they are looking for, because I believe that some of the strategic interests currently present, such as in Egypt. Egypt is existing because of financial aid from the Gulf states. The Gulf states are really looking forward to some of the Palestinians in other countries being naturalized. Will that be linked to the financial aid? Yes, these are possibilities. These are absolutely open possibilities. And I see that going forward, we should not bring along some of the framework that we were negotiating according to in the 1990s or in the 2000s, because the Middle East is changing, and is changing rapidly. And the conditions, even for talking about the right to return and refugees in the Middle East, is very different today compared to what was the situation in the 1990s. And in Taba.
Okay, because I didn't answer the question. Why Norway? You know, why Norway? And I would like to tell the audience that my doctoral thesis in history, which, by the way, the foreign ministry didn't like either. They liked none of my work. It's called Norway, Israel's best friend. No question mark. You know, I've done extensive research on this. And I think that, so if we go through documents, newspaper, opinion polls, whatever, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and partly into the 70s, there were almost no better friend of Israel in the whole of Europe than Norway. And then you could ask, how come that this has turned 180 degrees around? Because it has. And I haven't done research on that, but we have some explanations, and that is Norwegians in general, and now I'm again talking in general, a bit loud.
We generalize here.
Okay. We don't like occupation. We don't like strong parties. We don't like superpowers forcing someone or anyone to do anything at all. We tend to support the weaker party. And that was the main reason why the Norwegians supported so strongly Israel. Because Israel was seen as the weaker party. Israel was small David, and the Arab world was Goliath who forced and were threatening to Israel. But when, after Israel occupied these territories, after it became known, you know, in Norwegian newspapers in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the word Palestinians, Palestine, it does not exist. So I think that has to do with the effect of Lebanon in 1982, the effect of Norwegian soldiers serving in the Unified Force, the effect of the Intifada from 1907 onward. All of this has led the Norwegians to side more and more and more and more with the Palestinians, who they feel is the weaker party.
Let's have a short. We're now straying far from the original, but that's fine. I decide, so that's fine. Let's stick around on this because, I mean, I get what you're saying. I think that's probably part of it. But my feeling with Norwegian society, very Norwegian. I mean, we have a very Norwegian focus. It's fine with everything that's going on in Israel and Gaza, but one of the worst things is that they betrayed us. Because we came with the Oslo Accords, and they fucked it up. And that got to our pride, right? Because Jan Eklatant told the world that we were boxing up our weight, and we felt sort of good about it, and we were a humanitarian superpower, and then we tried to make peace, and we got there with Bill Clinton, and everything looked so good, and then it wasn't that good. And that got to our pride. That is just, I'm putting it out there. And Cecilie, now you seem to be...
I tend to think the same thing, actually. We're really disappointed with the parties. Now, I did this review for the NRK some years back of the coverage during 3 years of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from 2009 to 2012. It was during Kos-led and then afterwards. It was very striking how there was a lot of emotional coverage. So this conflict, compared to all other conflicts, is basically explained by other actors. It's the humanitarians, it's the witnesses on the ground, it's very emotional. Now, unlike all the other foreign policy subjects where you have the specialists in the parties actually doing the discussions, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is basically done by the party leaders. And it's very symbolic. It's like when I have to choose between the principle of protection and security, I will go for security. And so the party leaders are really using this conflict as a moral playground in order to say, I would do this. It doesn't cost them anything, but it's very visible and people intuitively understand what it means. So the coverage of this conflict in the Norwegian public is very different from all other conflicts, which also gives it a very, very emotional dimension. And when you keep seeing the effects of Israeli military operations, and you see them that on the civilian population, on children and on women, it creates this kind of sympathy with the underdog and even rage. I believe, because that is somewhat different in this conflict compared to coverage of other conflicts. I think it's a dangerous way of covering it, to be honest, but it does have this dimension.
Let's get the perspective from Denmark.
It's been like this since 1948. You know, it was just as emotional about glory, hallelujah, about Israel. You know, it was called a kind of the religious dream of the Labour Party, the Socialist Party. It was lacking knowledge, extremely emotional. So this is a very special case here in Norway.
Let's get perspective from the old colonial power, Denmark. I was always rooting for them, by the way. My family's from Denmark, but why?
In which conflict were you rooting?
The Norwegian
we always lose. Don't root for us. We left, right?
Yeah, but why is Norway different from Denmark, and why?
No, we very emotional as well. But I think. And I think the coverage is extremely emotional and really, as I said before, shows us the power of social media and the power, the sort of the lack of critical appraisal of what is being fed to you through social media. But what we've been discussing is really what one can call the Israeli exceptionalism, right? That there's one standard for Israel, and there's another standard for every other country in the same region. And I think what that ties up to is that we perceive Israel as white people. And that if they have a conflict with somebody who we perceive as not white, then there is an identification that boils down to this zero-sum kind of dichotomy where you can only have a good and a bad. My kids came back when in October they came and said, "Who are we with? Are we with Palestine?" And I said, "Oh, not so fast. We have bad people and stupid people and innocent victims on every side. This is like it's not that easy." And I think the reason why the left wing and other actors in our countries could not care less about Congo and South Sudan and Yemen and other conflicts is because there are no white people killing other people. And that's really, also hubris.
But
it tells us a lot about our own stupidity.
You have presented in terms of white bad and non-white good. But is there also this? I mean, that sounds like sort of.
No, it's in fact, you know what it is? It's racism.
Exactly.
So it is racism because we do not see. I'll tell you a little anecdote. The president of the Danish Palestinian Friendship Union has said to my paper, I don't want to discuss the Hamas. Well, if you don't want to discuss one of the warring parties, how are you going to praise the war? I mean, how are you going to even have an opinion about the war? How can you exclude that they exist? Nobody wants to talk about the Hamas. Well, the Hamas is, as I've detailed, they are clearly in a position where they can devise a military strategy and follow it with a great degree of success. I respect them as adult people with an ability to do a calculus. Respect them as individuals. But we don't. We see them as children, somebody who has to be cared for, somebody that we have to come and save. It's a traditional white savior complex.
I'll give you
We didn't vote them.
So this is the saying is the soft bigotry of low expectations. Who has this saying? Who am I quoting? Anyone in the who said this? The soft bigotry of low expectations. No, not Churchill. George Bush, the younger. Yes. I'm sorry. He said it. He was right. Yeah. Okay, Cecilie.
Okay. Coming back to definitions, because we are talking about that after all.
We're only
Can
talking
we
about
do
it.
that?
Yeah, it's just two different digressions.
Digressions. Now, can I move the conversation a little bit?
Try.
Because I'm quite fascinated at how we deal with genocide when it comes to this. I believe that the Hamas Charter, it goes back to the 1980s. It was during the Intifada. Hamas has been discussing whether to change it a number of times. Sheikh Ahmed Yazin, he was more or less about to change it, and then he was killed. The man who took over from him went through the same process. So within the leadership of Hamas, there has been an ongoing discussion for about 25 years about whether to accept the existence of the State of Israel. And a majority, I believe, would support that. And there is a minority that would not. And they hail, of course, from the 1948 refugees, and they would not then be given the right to return to the places where they would. I mean, we come back to the right of return eventually anyway. Now, some people are suggesting that the attack against Israel was genocidal. I do not think so. I think it was symbolically an attempt to reproduce the Holocaust in Europe. But like that was the threat. So it's a war crime because you do this as a threat to a nation. It is not really the intention to annihilate or and so forth. So you don't have the mens rea of genocide. And then, of course, the question now is, what about the way Israel is responding in Gaza? And I believe that the process that we have before the ICJ when it comes to the Genocide Convention is very similar to the one we have before the ICJ when it comes to Myanmar. It is very similar. It is not as such genocide that is being committed, but the lack of international institutions to, let's say, control the way the war is heading leads states to the ICJ, because the ICJ has this power, this instrument. So it is exactly the same thing that has been happening to Myanmar that will now start to happen to Israel. That states and others will be watching what happens in The Hague and try to, let's say, control the way the military operations are headed, meaning that Israel will be prevented from deporting a number of people, will be prevented from some things that may be a part of what the Israeli defense establishment would really like to do. They cannot do it anymore. Now, that does not mean that this is genocide. And I think in the process before The Hague, when it comes to Myanmar, some states have been arguing that we should lower the threshold for mens rea of genocide because it is so difficult to prove these days. I would be against that, but I do think that that is the discussion. I think, and then of course, why do we then call it genocide? Genocide is not about the quantity of people being killed. You can have one person killed and you can call it a genocide if the intention is there. So when when people talk about this as genocide, they're not talking about the legal concept of genocide. They're talking about a lot of people, the Palestinian people in Gaza, seemingly being killed in unacceptable numbers. So this is why you go to genocide and you use that, you use the word. And I think more than anything, it is because people are very frustrated because they see effects of war that they are not used to seeing.
But aren't these things sort of related? Because you said there is a very emotional discourse about Israel, and it's fed by a number of images. It's been that way for a long time, but it's been intensified with media and social media and that kind of stuff to a larger degree than other conflicts. I mean, I follow the war in Ukraine, the war in Yemen very closely. We don't have the same images, and it's not for lack of gruesome scenes, but it's for lack of video recordings. So isn't this, when you say, we use the language of genocide because we have to say something, and then that's, in a sense, it's a consequence of the way we portray the conflict in media and social media.
I must say one thing, because it is not always for lack of material. When we had the Western offensive against ISIS in Syria and Iraq, there were pictures from Mosul. Our allies, they were bombing hospitals, hospitals, maternities with not cluster bombs, but barrel bombs. They were burned to death. This was our allies in Mosul. There were pictures, and they were not shown.
Exactly. I mean,
there were pictures, and the media
was
basically asked not to show these pictures because the public didn't really need to see them. But we are now seeing them. So we were not shown these effects when our troops were engaged.
But you would agree
we are
that
now being shown the effects of the Israeli. And just let me take one remark now, because this is close to what I've been really following for years, and I've been publishing on this issue. When we had the Cluster Munition Convention negotiated in 2008, it was not because of the way we used cluster munitions in Kosovo in 1999, or the way we used it in Basra and Baghdad in 2003. It was because of the Israeli-Hezbollah war, where everyone could see the effects of the use of cluster munition. 2 years later, we had the convention, because people was woken up. Why? Because the armed conflict linked to Israel, against the Palestinians, against Hezbollah, and against the surrounding countries is visible to an extent that no other war in the modern world is visible. Not even Ukraine. Not even Ukraine.
And because they are prepared to use to exploit the suffering and the deaths on their own side. And it's not just, we talk about it as if this has been an organic process with the images coming out of this conflict. There were accounts ready on the 7th of October. On the 8th, there was a tool kit ready for university students. This has been prepared. This has been orchestrated. All these concepts that are being thrown around. Not a coincidence that we talk about ceasefire and not peace. All these concepts are being spoon-fed, and it's not just from the Middle East. It has, I think, a clear footprint or a blueprint, which is Russian. And I think we are, in the West, extremely naive, and about 10 years behind.
I agree with that. However, I do think that it is legitimate for a party involved in an armed conflict to use the instruments at its disposal. Not to go beyond, but to use what you can. And I do believe that the Palestinians, after 2009, and Cast-led ended the way that it did, they made a new plan to get a legal intifada, so to speak, to become recognized as a state, to be able to access all the international arenas where you can basically fight in a court of law, which is also why the ICC now has jurisdiction over what is taking place in Gaza, and it changes everything. We now have a situation where the ICJ in The Hague has said, if the Palestinian civilian population under Hamas control is treated in this and this way, we will basically be able to stop the supply of weapons to Israel. That is the legal situation that the Palestinians have currently gotten themselves to. Of course, that is the result of a strategy, and it is working pretty well for the Palestinians.
A question, Cecilie. This is one of our long-standing disagreements. It's not the content of international law, but the consequences of international law. So, do you think that if there is a verdict, limiting some of these things, do you think that that will really be followed up by the US and Israel, which is going to be the most important factor here? Because that's not always the case with countries involved.
Now I'm going to say something that a lot of people here are not going to like. I just warn you, everyone. I don't like it myself, for that matter. What is currently happening is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is being caught up in a much bigger struggle. And it has to do with the global South and the Western institutions.
Agreed.
And what is currently happening is that yesterday Nicaragua brought Germany before the ICJ, because Germany, as the legal country that it is, a rule of law, and it's light for nations these days, so to speak. They have accepted the compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ. So Nicaragua is bringing Germany before the court, saying that you cannot cooperate with Israel, you cannot export guns, you are not violating the Geneva Conventions and the Genocide Convention by your cooperation with Israel. There is this kind of battle going on, and it hasn't really got very much to do with Israel.
I agree. And this is,
and
China
Gaza.
is in this and Russia in this.
Exactly.
I think my point is more that, if decisions there go too far from the interest of the big powers, what will happen is that the ICJ will lose its sway over those countries.
Probably Germany must consider to withdraw from the compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ, like the Americans did in 1986. Exactly. So that is one of the problems, what happens then? And of course, how does that reflect back on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Well, it remains to be seen. But we do know, I mean, I think this thing has gotten bigger than Israel-Palestine, and it's living a very different life. And then it comes back to how do we use definitions in that context?
I have a small insert comment and then I have a question for Torkel. So what you're saying is interesting in a sense, because for all the years between 2014, the war in 2014, and now, Israel has been on the back burner in the Western media. I mean, we used to say, Norwegians are obsessed with conflict in the Middle East, but we haven't really been for those years, because there's been too much else going on. It's the Crimean crisis.
There has been a lot of war in the Middle East
Exactly.
since 2013.
Exactly. Yeah, but
And the Palestinian leadership has been split.
Yeah, exactly. So you have the Syrian, the refugee crisis. You had the pandemic. You had the Afghanistan, the Russian crisis. A lot of other things that really matter to us. Whereas the Israeli conflict has been a conflict of passion, not a conflict of national interest in a sense. And now it's coming back, and it's coming back partly because it's, as you say, it's part of a much bigger game that matters to us. And that's part of the Norwegian strategy as well. We care not only about what happens there, we care about the global south, what's going to happen with the global south and Russia, what's the Norwegian interest in this. And all this brings me to Torkel. That's really a small leap of mind. It shows in a sense how a lot of these legal terms are very political terms that we use for all these different things. And but maybe you could address it when you talk about the refugee crisis that we talked about. And it's in a sense it's a central concept because it is the question of the one-state solution or the two-state solution. And when you look at the Jewish refugees from the Arab countries, it's about the same amount, coincidentally.
A few more. Yeah.
And of course, they were integrated into Israel. I don't think a lot of them would like to return, but they could have been kept, and some of them possibly would have liked to return because the Mizrahi and the Sephardim culture is separate cultures with long traditions in Baghdad and other places. And what does this tell us about the nature? How do we talk about this? For instance, the Jewish refugees.
I just think mainly that there's very little knowledge about this. There's very little knowledge in Norway and most European countries about the incredible diversity in Israel among Jews. So that's a problem, I think, and that many of the cultural and political cleavages in Israel, they go along, of course, these lines, and they're playing out now, in Israeli politics. And I think that, so knowledge is not there. But what's the question, Nils August?
Having your perspective on sort of the political use of concepts. I mean, you could have chosen, Israel could say, these people are not Israelis. They are going to be placed in, a refugee camp, going to be called the Sephardim camp somewhere, and we're going to use them as a pawn to negotiate with Egypt and Morocco and Iraq and everything.
Wow, that's an interesting counterfactual scenario. I never thought of that. Yeah, interesting. I don't know. It's I think it's such a big part of the nature of the Israeli society today, that this diversity is there, and I think we just need to get more knowledge about it, to get people to talk about it, and that also goes to the debate that you started about whiteness, and you, Nils August, that that there is a sense that there's white savior complex. I don't know if that's right, but if we think of Israel as a white society, that's wrong, right? It's not a white society, and And we need to teach kids on college campuses the facts that it isn't a white society. It's a diverse society, and of course there is an Ashkenazi component of society that came from Europe. We all know this story, but this feeds into some of the very dangerous and difficult debates that you started discussing some minutes ago about how we see this, how we see what's the essence of the conflict. Whites against you said that. I'm not going to say that, but it sounds horrible. But whites against brown people and etc. And that's the problem. So, but I was hoping to speak about the LO, but
we're going to go in for landing, and you can talk about them in your last appeal. Usually, when people say we're going to go in for landing, it means it's like 1 minute. But if you're in a plane, it's like usually like 25 minutes. so we'll start going for landing and see how long it takes. And we're going to be on the sort of constructive note. Like, is there anything? Should we do anything? Is there anything? Norway, Denmark. What kind of approach can we have to do something? And in that, I'm only going to have one critical question. It's for you. Because you said that the Hamas strategy is working, and I have one more question to that. I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said, but if Hamas is actually dislodged from the physical power structures in Gaza completely, what are the options after that, both for Hamas and for Israel? I want to just put that into the mix that you can answer, but you can think about it, so I'll start with Hilde.
What do you want me to comment on? What do you want me to comment on?
What should be in this context that we're in now? The conflict is what it is, the war is there. What should Norway and the international society do? You said so yourself, like these are the questions we have to solve. Is there anything we can do in your review, and what is it?
I think first and foremost it is extremely important to kind of hold on to the history, in the sense that make this history, this background from, let's say, 48 and onwards, very clear. Not start discussion with thousands of years ago, and then move on, as I see it, to a more kind of pragmatic discussion about how are we going to solve this conflict. Because there is really out of the question that 6 million Palestinians are going to return to Israel. No way out of the question. It is also out of the question that, let's say, the 5 million Palestinians living on the Gaza Strip and on the West Bank are going to be transferred or forced or voluntarily moved into the Arab countries, regardless of the lousy policy of the Arab countries, because it's lousy. But still, the problem for Israel and the Palestinians and for Norway is, what are we now going to do?
And you'd say, it's in a sense, it's a renewed impetus for the two-state solution to really come back to the table, because it has been on the back burner for...
It has absolutely been on the back burner. And I think that in my mindset, I think that if we should go for a practical political solution, that is the only option left. Because there are no other options on the table, and it's also, I think, out of the question to continue as we have done during the last 10 or 20 years with just kind of holding on to the same policy without any kind of long-term solutions. So I would then say that we should support, go for, negotiate for a two-state solution.
Thank you. Anne Sofie, with the critical question.
But is it realistic?
No, but you have only bad solutions.
I know.
You have only bad solutions.
I mean, we are, if we had to say down there, I'm sure everything would be fine. But 75 years later, we have very stuck positions. What has happened? You said, yes, did they miscalculate the Hamas? Part of this was to show every Palestinian, including those in the West Bank, that the Hamas can do something that the Fatah cannot do. They are pulling towards some sort of joint umbrella. They might be exiled. There's been negotiations to exile some of the leadership. The leadership is intact. Hamas is an idea. It's a fundamentalist, doomsday type idea, but still an idea, and it's very difficult to eradicate an idea. So it's not going to be eradicated, which is part of the problem with the IDF strategy. But so yes, the Gaza Strip can be occupied by military forces for a long period. But of course, I don't think that anyone in power today wants the Israelis to stay in the Gaza Strip.
Just a quick question on that,
Yeah.
because a lot of people say, and it's true, you can't eradicate an idea, but that's not always the goal. I mean, the goal could be to dislodge the physical structures
that's
of
also
power.
what the IDF says.
You bring in
Dismantle.
You bring in the PA, and maybe with okay,
Right.
we all know how terrible that sounds, but still, and then time goes by, and people work against the two-state solution, and then the idea weakens over time. That would be sort of the idea.
I mean, what is Hamas? It is it's a doomsday cult, or is it a revolutionary process? I think this time has a lot of parallels to the 70s. We also see it in our continent. When Catalonia tried to pull out of Spain, that was a revolutionary idea. It was it was kind of a 70s revolution. There was no plan. It was just like disrupting, and it also exiled a few leaders. This it had the same revolutionary power. And what we see is, yes, the Palestinian factions are discussing things for the first time in decades. The U.S. are sort of dusting off a two-state solution. For the first time in history, big powers in the region says we might not only recognize and finally have peace with Israel, but we might even throw in some security guarantees and also be part of a solution. That is all. There's a lot of promise, and with a war, you can go a lot of ways. And let's hope for the best. But we are not the parties, and there's a reason this has not been solved for 75 years. So we have to have a humility around that. But I also want to say that there are right now about 7 million of each, and and in fact there's a little more Palestinians. There's a reason to have a lot of babies is to expand. A reason to put people in the West Bank, is something to negotiate about. It's all facts on the ground. But Israel needs to be pragmatic on a solution, because Israel needs to be the democratic state. And it's part of the essence of Israel. So maybe something will happen.
The question is, what should we do? I don't know what to do about the situation. I mean, this would be crazy to suggest anything. It's very difficult. But I think that there's a lot to say about what we should do here in Norway, and particularly we need to recognize the fact that the Norwegian reaction to the 7th October massacre was really lousy, in the sense that. I just mean in the symbolic sense. Things like the Ministry of Foreign Affairs telling the king not to send his condolences. Things like no Norwegian city, including Oslo, even considering flying the Israeli flag on the 8th of October. So there, I mean, we have an anti-racist organization that hijacked the Kristallnacht commemoration in 23, etc., etc. And these things mean a lot to many people. And we need to recognize that. And I think we need more voices, really, in the public arena that stands up against those kinds of really bad decisions and really bad ways of framing this, and the lack of symbolic sympathy. That's something that I've been thinking hard about.
And, we are just having a short interruption for a commercial intervention. You can read all about the latest criticism of the ARS and their endorsement of the anti-Zionism thing in Minerva tomorrow. Oh. So that was not agreed on beforehand. We'll end with. I mean, you do overestimate the power of international law, but you're still one of the wisest women around here, Cecilie. You'll have the last word today.
We'll pick up on that debate somewhere else. Okay. I have a confession to make, because I have been reflecting on this issue about the coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Norway for about 3 decades. And I came to the conclusion about 8 years ago that it's very simplistic, it's very emotional driven, it has very simple, figurative ways of being presented. It's the rich and high-tech white Jews against the melanin-rich, poor Palestinians. I mean, this is kind of the overall view. If the Israelis only decided to stop, this conflict would end tomorrow.
Oh, yeah.
This kind of simplistic way of describing this conflict, I have thought is bad, but it has a function in my country, because it is the way for a number of young people to become engaged in politics. Why? Because finally they see something that is black and white. And I can support the victims. Okay? My grandparents supported the Jews under the Holocaust. Now I can support the victims of the victims. And I can engage. And the entire Norwegian public has kind of responded a little bit to that, the politicians and the way we cover it and so forth. And I've been thinking, almost everyone I know from Norway who go to the Middle East for the first time, they are surprised because they find a conflict that is different from the one that they have been reading about. Because it doesn't really belong there. And I have a confession to make. I have changed my mind. I think that is a very unwise, unhealthy thing. Because when you are so simplistic and so emotionally driven, you are so easily manipulated.
Oh, yeah.
And this is my problem. How to do something about that? How can we tell the young people and the old people, supposedly wiser than that, but apparently not. How can we tell them that the world is much more complicated? This is not our war. We must make sure that it doesn't become our war. Because when it comes here, it absorbs other types of tensions in our society. We have mechanisms for those. We do not want to copy the Middle East. And this is the responsibility of all of us. Point number 1. We will expose a number of things. No, point number 2, because this is a critical moment for the Middle East. I sincerely still believe that 5 years the Middle East will look very different, either better or much, much worse. Now, I do still believe that there is a possibility for the better Middle East. And what we should do is to try to do everything in our power not to mess up that possibility. It is not us who are going to suffer the consequences of a forced peace or a bigger war, but we must do everything we can not to destroy those forces who are working for good. Thirdly, there is a thing with the Gaza war. What is the thing with the Gaza war? A number of children and civilians were killed in the first 3-4 weeks. Were there Israeli soldiers on the ground in the first 3-4 weeks? No. Who did the intelligence gathering? Who did the target selection? What happened? That is where we are going to direct our anger. Not at the Israelis, but at the way this war was fought, because I do think that this is the first war we see the result of autonomous weapon systems. This is it. Do we want this war, or do we want this type of war? Because the next war we are going to have, we are not going to see the same pictures. So this is our opportunity to say something about how we as a civilization, not the Israelis, but we as a civilization actually accept that our wars are being fought. So bring it up. Don't keep it as a pro or anti-Israeli thing. Look at what it is. And then if you are interested, you can give me a mail. I can give you a lot of information about how other Western nations and non-Western nations use these systems. This is when we see it. Don't make it an anti-Israeli or by all means an anti-Jewish thing. It's actually something of our civilization that we should bring beyond the Middle East from this war. Thank you very much.
That will be a question for a further debate, I hope. Thank you so much, Cecilie, Torkel, Anne Sofie, Hilde. My one takeaway from this is we should all care a little bit less about content in the Middle East. And also, if you're like me, you will now make a run for the toilet, but I'm going to beat you there. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. We were so nervous about this night. We had to start drinking half of the wine. You noticed there wasn't so much wine left. It was me and the Kos Kaos team, Esther and Andrea, Nigar and Ilan. We were so nervous about this night because this conversation can go in so many directions. You were all amazing, really. Thank you so much. So insightful. 8th of March. We're not in October still, we're in March. Although some Israelis still think they're in October, but we're not. 8th of March we are celebrating the Women's Day. And we have a lot of things going on in the Middle East that we talk about today. There's been numerous accounts of sexual violence that happened to the Israeli women. Men det gikk også bra på engelsk. Jeg hadde skikkelig bra engelsk. Uansett, hvis jeg skal si det på trøndersk da. Men altså, men komme den 8. mars, da joiner vi, har dere lyst til å si det, eller? Ja. Siden nå har vi, nå skal de her damene her,
Vi skal stå under fanen Me Too Unless You're a Jew. Og det og vi trenger flere som skal gå med oss. Vi står bak parolen mot seksuell vold som krigsvåpen, som våpen i krig. Og vi ønsker å markere det som skjedde 7. oktober i Israel, og som ignoreres, og som fortsatt foregår i de dagene, fordi det fortsatt unge kvinner som sitter i Hamas fangerskap og blir voldtatt der. Får vi beskjed fra de som returnert. Vi ønsker å få flere med oss under denne fanen.
Hammersborg torg klokka 5:30 møtes vi, og vi deler ut plakater.
Møtes hvor?
Hammersborg torg klokken 5:30 fredag 8. mars. Please come and join us.
Yes, thank you very much. Tusen takk alle sammen. Tusen takk for at vi gikk av hele litt.
اليوم شيشي.
Let's go in the bed. That's one.